My name is Lisa Hansen. I am an MIPP student. I'm concentrating in American Foreign Policy, and this is my final semester at SAIS. It's been really wonderful. One of the difficult things about being an MIPP is we don't have as many classes to take, so I really regret having to pick and choose, and I haven't been able to take any classes with you, and I was disappointed about that, but I'm really glad to have this opportunity to meet with you today. I am taking a class right now on media and international relations, and we just were given an assignment to do an analysis of the Rolling Stone story from last spring on General McChrystal.
Okay.
And that got me thinking, because one of the things that came through in that story, and then subsequently I just read a cover story in Foreign Policy magazine by Ahmad Rashid about the relationship between Washington and Afghanistan and how that's non-existent, really. Obama and Petraeus even is supposedly not on great relations with Karzai. And one of the things that struck me in reading the McChrystal article was that, and the Ahmad Rashid article said this as well, that McChrystal and Karzai had very good relations, and that was really the one solid relation between the two countries. So it got me to thinking, it got me thinking a couple of questions, but on one level, is sort of the general as diplomat, and that was a very interesting paradigm to me that I hadn't thought much about, and it seemed like the relationship was very important, you know, diplomatically as well as strategically. And I was wondering about your analysis of how difficult or problematic it might be if there is not or if there's a contentious relationship and there's not at least a grounding.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Let me talk about it in a couple of ways. I'm Tom Keaney. I'm associated with the Strategic Studies program. The course on leadership is not associated with Strategic Studies. It's more in general about leadership in all sorts of venues. So let me talk about it from both aspects, about Strategic Studies and then leadership, particularly in terms of Petraeus and Karzai. And you're absolutely right. That is, the diplomat, the commander in the theater has a great call for a good diplomatic relationship because he's there. President Obama is back here. So on a day-to-day basis, the relationship of those two individuals is all important. And the ability of General Petraeus and earlier before him, General McChrystal, to really make that work is all important. It's really all important. McChrystal, I think, had a very good relationship, but let me comment on Petraeus' relationship. A good relationship is not necessarily a friendly relationship. For instance, Petraeus is coming from his experience in Iraq, where his relationship with President Maliki was often very contentious. That is, he had to come in and press him over and over to do this or to include the Shia in the government in a number of issues. So Petraeus' nature is to be very forceful and I wouldn't say overbearing, but his diplomacy is very much, has a sharp edge to it. If that isn't working with Karzai, and nobody knows quite sure whether it is or not, then it's not working. However, the fact that Petraeus has a much more harder edge than McChrystal doesn't mean one is good and one is bad. It depends on how Karzai relates to each one. And in terms of General Petraeus, it depends on how he can understand Karzai's relation and then adjust to it, or make Karzai address better to him. So it is a very personal as well as an institutional relationship. He's the military commander. He's the president of Afghanistan. But they are two. They also have something that is much more in common. So he doesn't supplant President Obama. President Obama has his own political strategy, but he has to make it work in the theater. So it remains to be seen how this is going to work. But I wouldn't take necessarily Petraeus' style being different from McChrystal's style as being that he's less effective. We'll see that.
Well, one of the reasons that I asked is because there was, in this foreign policy article, there was such an emphasis on the relationship, I think, between Karzai and McChrystal, because it was sort of the only good one left that after the Bush administration switched.
Yes.
For Karzai, and now he sort of feels like the lone wolf and doesn't have any, confidence in the U.S. and close relationships there. And that article didn't specifically talk about Petraeus, but then this morning I actually was reading about an incident that was really contentious with Petraeus, over civilian casualties and
yes.
Some comments. So, I mean, how much of a difference do you think that makes on the ground in terms of, I understand that you just said it's very significant, but in practical terms, if there were to be, is that something that from a perspective in Washington, that the Washington leadership would want to, not to interfere in, but to...
But step into.
Because I certainly think we've all heard about Karzai, and it certainly sounds like he needs to be challenged on a lot of issues. But I'm just wondering, sort of the thrust of this article was that we also have to make him feel good.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, from a leadership and military perspective.
Let me talk about it from President Obama's perspective in terms of his leadership. He fired General McChrystal for, I think, all sorts of good reasons. He brought in General Petraeus, who had great success in Iraq in 2008. If he relieves Petraeus, that is sending all the wrong signals.
Yeah.
In other words, who do you have that's better?
Sure.
So in terms of a leadership, he looks at both Petraeus and Karzai. And if Petraeus, for domestic purposes, is as good as it's going to get,
right.
How do you handle that? You can't fire Petraeus.
Right, no.
You can't fire Karzai.
Right.
So at most, you have discussions with Petraeus about, do you think this is leading to some sort of productive way?
Right.
Let me add one more thing. Probably in 3 or 4 months, General Petraeus is going to leave.
I was going to ask about this.
And a second very important American individual, the U.S. Ambassador Eichenberg, is probably going to leave.
Okay.
So from the president's perspective, okay, how do I manage that?
Right.
You've got Karzai, who presumably is not going anywhere.
Right.
He's got an opportunity to bring in 2 new people, a civilian and a military officer. And what he's got to think of is, okay, what is the dynamic I want to set up there? Right. First of all, I want the ambassador and the military leader to be on good terms and be somehow working together. And also, how do they each work with President Karzai? So I think from the president's perspective, in terms of he looking at the diplomatic military aspect,
right.
He's got some decisions he's going to have to make. I think for the short term, Petraeus is there and he's going to stay.
Right.
But I think the longer term is important.
Yeah, definitely. That'll be very interesting to see. And I know the new replacement for Holbrooke, who has just been, I don't know if you know anything about him, but
yes.
It seems like sometimes when you have special envoys and on top of official ambassadors and military,
yes.
Do you think that's, I suppose it could work either way, but do you have any thoughts on having these?
Always difficult, and sometimes you can't tell ahead of time. Sometimes you can't. Mark Grossman, who is slated to replace Holbrooke, is very good. He's spoken at SAIS. He's spoken in this next room to us, to the students. He comes across very well. He's dealt with the military as both an ambassador and in the State Department for a number of years. So, particularly for him, I'm very confident as a special representative. But what you've just added, of course, is one more person.
Right.
How does Mark Grossman work with a new ambassador? How does he work with a new military officer? So that is going to have to go into the plan also. And also, I had to point out, of course, this July is sort of the first date when the president has said, okay, we're going to make a decision on how we go forward from this July. So this is all coming together from the president's perspective as well as other folks in a very interesting way. I'm anxious to see what does happen.
Yeah. Do you think that the president's going to necessarily have much, he'll certainly have some leeway, but one of the other things I've been thinking about, just through my courses on American foreign policy, is the extent to which American public opinion is behind this. And we've seen in other countries that were involved in Afghanistan, and public opinion turned sharply and they retreated.
Yes, yeah.
It seems to me like it would be very difficult to not start, demonstrably winding down, especially with an election coming up and, public opinion being especially important. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, compared to healthcare, this is an easy one for President Obama, or an easier one for President Obama. His main support for staying comes from the Republicans.
Right.
His main support for leaving is with the Democrats. So he has a bit more leeway in this. Also, he's been very careful of pointing out, first of all, July of 2011, we're going to start to take our troops. But he's been very careful to not say how many troops. I think the best vision I have of this now is what President Obama and many other folks, the services have. Between July of 2011 and 2014, well past the election, is that the U.S. drawdown will take place. So we're really not looking at 6 months. We're really looking at 3 years. So I think that will go right through the election. I don't think, depends on what happens in the next year, but I think in July they will make maybe predict, which is not my strong suit, but they will start to make demonstrable moves, not necessarily in terms of numbers, but in terms of responsibilities of the Afghan forces. That will be the trend, and that will be followed by decreasing numbers. But I think that's what we're going to see in the next year.
And do you think they're going to be probably figuring in a lot of additional scenarios now that they didn't have a year ago in terms of forces, the situation in the Middle East, and where...
With everything that's going on in the Middle East? I don't think anything that's going on in the Middle East, again, I hate to predict because I'm not good at it, anything in the Middle East is going to call for a large number of U.S. forces. Certainly not in Egypt, not in Libya, not almost anywhere. In other words, diplomatic influence, maybe trade embargoes and things such as that. But I can't foresee right now, which means it may come, but I can't foresee right now where it would call for increased U.S. military involvement. Humanitarian rescue of embassy people in Yemen, for instance, if something like that takes place. But nothing would take large numbers. So it would be smaller in the contingencies of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much.
A pleasure. Okay, nice meeting you, Lee.
Such a pleasure to have a one-on-one. Thank you.